Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is the new director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, Dan Hamilton. Dan is a former State Department official who also holds the Wilson Center title of Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow. Dan, welcome to the Wilson Center and also to Wilson Center Now. Great to have you.
Thanks so much, John. Pleasure to be here.
So I mentioned your history with the State Department. If you could tell our viewers a bit more about your career and your focus on Europe and on transatlantic issues.
Well, I've had a lifelong experience with Europe. My father was an Air Force officer based in Germany in the 1960s. So I got off the boat, really literally, the USS United States on a cruise when I was in kindergarten, and spent a lot of time, and then over now and then probably 17, 18 years living in Europe, including the last 8 months I've lived in Berlin through the pandemic. But I've been at think tanks. I was lived in West Berlin when the wall was there. It was a divided city during the entire 1980s. I was there when the wall came down, Berlin Wall, and I was then advisor to the U.S. Embassy, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke at the time, and then in the State Department working with Secretary Albright and Secretary Warren Christopher as the Associate Director of their policy planning staffs. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, doing NATO and security issues, plus Nordic Baltic issues and the Balkans. Everyone at that time dealt with the Balkans, so that was much of my role. But since then, I've been at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, running a program on U.S., Europe, and world order. And so delighted to join the Wilson Center.
And we're delighted to have you. And tell us about that decision to come to the center. What are your visions and hopes for the program?
Well, I think if you look at Europe today, I would think it's helpful to work with Americans to understand sort of, current European dynamics. And simply stated, probably think about it in three ways. One, what's going on in Europe? The continent seemed to be coming together. Now maybe it's falling apart. There's Brexit, there's Russian intervention in Ukraine, there's unrest, populism, migration crises, the pandemic. It's really quite a story now. Europe has again become a very turbulent continent. I think it's hard to keep track of things. I think a second issue is what does Europe mean for the United States? What is the transatlantic relationship about going forward? It's not just NATO. We have the densest economic relationship of any continent actually with Europe, despite the rise of China and everything. Europe is still our major commercial partner. And then we have issues about how we deal with privacy, lots of digital disconnects going on. Lots of what we do at home in our domestic policies is mirrored in other democracies in Europe, and I think we learn from each other. So there's a robust transatlantic agenda. And then third, Europe is an actor on the global stage. So global Europe, how does Europe relate to us when we talk about China? What about climate change? What about the Middle East? How about Africa? A whole set of issues in which Europe really is everywhere in terms of its impact and its influence.
Dan, the things you mentioned, whether it be Brexit or migration issues or the pandemic or climate change, any one of these alone are seismic happenings, and they're all happening at the same time. This may be difficult to get a read on, and you alluded to it in your answer, but how stable is the bloc currently? And I wonder if dealing with the pandemic has been a unifying thing or a divisive thing.
Well, we are commemorating 30 years of German unification just on October 3rd, so it's coming up. So it's useful, I think, to think of that span of time. 30 years ago, those walls all came down, the Cold War ended, and sort of, I think, for the next few decades, we were all sort of part of an idea that the Western-led order would just continue to expand, be a magnetic force in which other societies and peoples would want to join in, that we would take them into our community, if you will. The United States would play sort of a benign role, supportive of European integration. Russia at some point probably could fit into that system. We had high hopes for China maybe doing the same. And I think starting maybe particularly with the Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014, a whole cascade of issues started to happen that have really challenged that premise. Uh, the shock before that was the last financial crisis in 2008, which of course threw the Europeans for a loop as it did in the United States. But then you had the migration crisis, which overwhelmed Europe's capacity to deal with things. You had the Brexit decision. You had yet further populist, revolts against the very notion of deeper Europe. Uh, a whole conflation of crises, all happening at the same time. And just when they seem to be getting a hold of some of this, now we have the pandemic and yet another huge economic challenge. So I think the Europeans are reeling as we are about what to make of all of this. Uh, the story in Europe with the pandemic was not a good one last spring at the beginning. Each country basically shut down and didn't want to share any of its medical equipment or masks or medicines with even other European countries. Um, and only after a bit of time did they realize that was an impossible thing to do because Europe is so densely integrated. So they have done relatively better than the United States, although there are important pockets of Europe that have suffered tremendously from the pandemic. They have, in certain parts of Europe, such as Germany, where I just spent 8 months, I lived the pandemic living in Berlin. And I have to say, that it was a complete lockdown in March and very tough for a number of weeks, and then gradually started to open up in a way that one didn't see here in the United States. We are still living through the first wave, and the Germans have gone into a different mode now, where their schools are back open, people are out and about. They're facing new cases again, so they're debating that. But overall, the Europeans have tried to come together. I think the most important thing they did this summer was they agreed in the middle of all this in a massive sort of solidarity fund to help the countries most hit by the pandemic. The Germans sort of broke this notion that they wanted to stick to balanced budgets and realized that, they really had to step up and help their neighbors. That's kind of a fundamental change in that mentality. And at the same time, they approved a budget going forward for the next 7 years in the European Union, which really, takes on big challenges going forward, like climate change or energy transition, development policies. So despite all of that, the pull apart forces, they've done a reasonably good job of kind of holding things together.
A long-term budget alone suggests a certain amount of stability, so that's a hopeful sign.
It's not done yet. The
Not done yet,
Parliament
but
has to approve it, but they're making progress.
your thoughts on U.S. relations with the EU and with Europe writ large, since now Brexit has occurred and there's more than just one bloc to deal with.
Right. Well, I always say, especially if you go to Brussels, people in the EU world always conflate the term EU with Europe. And it's important always, I think, especially to say, Europe is not the EU. The EU is part of Europe, but this continent is big, diverse, and turbulent. And the further east you go in Europe, in sort of the disordered spaces of Europe that are not part of the EU or NATO, you find, volatility. You find people who really don't know where their future lies. That's the entire Balkan periphery, plus up into Eastern Europe and extending into the Black Sea. That's all still Europe. But it's not a Europe that's tethered, right, to any real institution. So Europe is not a finished project. It's still dealing with lots of issues. At the same time, when one of its key members has decided to leave the European Union. So that's a challenge. And I think it challenges Americans to think about how we should think about the continent. During that 30-year time frame, it was easy to think Europe was stable, right? The Cold War ended. There's no more problem. We have other challenges elsewhere in the world. The Europeans should be able to take care of themselves. And while I wish that were true, what we have seen is Europe is actually quite fragile again. And I think that it's really a question for Americans. Do we continue to have the same stake in Europe that we had in the past? I would argue that there is the deep trend going on in the United States that makes it hard to answer that question. And it's not about one political party. Uh, During the Cold War, after World War II, for 70 years, really, I think generations of American leaders and the American public had a few kind of intuitive understandings. They weren't often sort of said directly, but they informed how we worked with our European partners. One was that Europe was not only important to America, it was urgent. It was like the number one problem, right? We had fought we had taught two world wars. We were in the middle of a Cold War. Not getting Europe right was really bad for the United States, and we understood that in an intuitive way that informed not only our foreign policy but some of our domestic policies. I think a second intuitive notion was that the European order was integral to world order. There was a direct link of how Europe was structured that would influence how the world could be ordered. So if we could get it right in Europe and have a space where war doesn't happen, where prosperity unfolds, market-based economies, democracies that are allied to us, that'll be the core of a liberal order, a rules-based order that would be global. And the third, unfortunately, was we had an intuitive sense that despite the hopes we had for our European colleagues, they seemed unable to manage their own civil wars, if I would call it that. They couldn't deal with their own conflicts on the continent. That's why the US presence was still needed. We believed we could have pulled back after the end of the Cold War, and yet the Bosnian conflict, the conflicts in the Balkans were a fire that were spreading throughout the European neighborhood beyond just that little region. And it was really only a realization we had to re-engage again that finally stopped those fires again. And so we are still back in Europe. We're still a European presence. But I think the quick difference, if I could just summarize it, is that for those 70 years, we were a European power. We were fully engaged. We were comprehensively engaged in all the coalitions and networks the Europeans themselves were creating. We provided a real sense of reassurance to the Europeans, not only that they had a partner, but we reassured the Europeans about each other after they had engaged in two world wars. You know, those lingering memories can't be discounted. And the Americans were always kind of there. I think today we are drifting to become not a European power, but a power in Europe. It's a simple turn of phrase, but it's a very different notion. It's not comprehensively engaged. It's an America that's selectively engaged. It's an America that's not necessarily committed to the notion of European integration. It is a notion that maybe we can play some of our allies off against each other and get the better deal.
And is that a pre-Trump trend, or is in
yes.
other words, yeah, okay.
It is a deeper trend. It's not about Donald Trump. I think the president has amplified that, but I think it's a mistake to reduce American policy or American sentiment to Donald Trump. It's not, and public opinion polls are interesting. They show, most recently, the Chicago Council last week had its annual poll, showed really strong support for NATO in the United States across the board, age, generation, political persuasion. But buried in that was the notion that the allies have to do more. And President Trump's tapped into that idea. But it was an idea that's been around for a long time. And so I do think there's something there, there's a wrinkle in the story that we need to take care of. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what is our stake in Europe going forward? Do we believe it's a stable continent, or is it a fragile continent? Does our presence there really make a difference, or can we afford to let the Europeans sort of figure it out on their own? I'm of the persuasion personally that we're not there yet to be able to do that. And what we've learned through our history is usually if we pull out too soon, we ignore those problems or the twilight zones of Europe, as I mentioned, we always end up paying a higher price later. And I'm cautious that we might be now slipping into that cycle again.
Well, on that cautionary note, I want to thank you for that fascinating analysis. And it's really exciting to have you on board at the Wilson Center. You've given us a preview of the things that you're going to be working on and how you think about them. And it's really something to look forward to. Thank you, Dan Hamilton, for joining us today.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Wilson Center Now. In addition to thanking Dan Hamilton, thank you for joining us. We look forward to you coming back for our next edition. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.